Hello everyone. Welcome to the first episode of The Architecture of Politics, a new series exploring the buildings which, in one way or another, support the operation of political systems around the world. Naturally enough, we're going to start with the so-called Mother of Parliaments, the Palace of Westminster. Why does the British Parliament meet at Westminster? The meeting place of the Houses of Parliament is a rather contentious issue these days. Some people argue that the UK economy has become too London-centric, and that moving Parliament to a regional city might help to redress this. However, the link between Parliament and Westminster dates back hundreds of years. Indeed, the evolution of Parliament as an institution has gone hand in hand with the physical development of the Palace of Westminster. In this video, we explore the origins of the palace and how it became the home of Parliament. Today, the Palace of Westminster is arguably one of the most iconic buildings in the world. But get that image out of your head. It might look medieval, but in fact, most of the current palace is Victorian. In other words, it's less than 200 years old. The origins of the palace and of Parliament go back much further than that. The city of Westminster can trace its origins back to around 960 AD, when St Dunstan, then Bishop of London, founded a monastery on a site around 1.5 miles upriver from the western edge of the City of London. A town gradually grew up around the abbey, and in 1540 Westminster became a city in its own right. The City of Westminster still exists today as an administrative entity, although the area has now been swallowed up by the Greater London conurbation. During the reign of Edward the Confessor, from 1043 to 1066, construction of a royal palace was begun close to the abbey, although no buildings now remain from this era. During the Anglo-Saxon period, the royal court was mobile and there was no fixed capital city. It was only after the Norman conquest in 1066 that the Palace of Westminster gradually became established as the principal residence of the English monarchy. An obvious indication of Westminster's increasing importance was the construction of Westminster Hall during the 1090s. Commissioned by King William II, it was the largest hall in England at that time. Later, a second hall, known as the Lesser Hall, was constructed immediately south of Westminster Hall, probably during the early 12th century. This plan from 1807 shows how the two halls sat in relation to each other, with the River Thames to the east of them. To the south of the two halls, that is, to the left of your screen, was the so-called Privy Palace. Privy essentially means private. In other words, this was the more private part of the palace where the king actually lived, whereas the Great Hall was used for more public ceremonies. One of the most important parts of the Privy Palace was the Painted Chamber, which was completed during the reign of Henry III in 1236. It got its name because elaborate murals were painted on its walls, like this one showing the coronation of King Edward the Confessor, which survived into the 19th century. The Painted Chamber was originally the king's bedchamber, and an adjoining chamber was soon built for his wife, Queen Eleanor. The Queen's Chamber would later become the meeting place of the House of Lords, as seen in this famous painting of the death of the Earl of Chatham in 1778. In 1348, King Edward III set up a religious foundation called St Stephen's College. This was not a college in the modern-day sense of an educational establishment. It was a religious organisation whose principal function was to sing masses for the souls of deceased English kings, in accordance with the Catholic theology of the time. To house the college, an extensive set of buildings were constructed to the south of Westminster Hall. The most important of these was the College Chapel, which was completed in the 1360s, with extravagant Gothic architecture inspired by the famous Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. These digital reconstructions were produced by the Virtual St Stephen's project at the University of York. So, how did the Palace of Westminster become the home of Parliament? The origins of the English Parliament are complex, but during the medieval period it was common practice for kings to summon councils of their leading barons and churchmen in order to seek their advice. Thanks partly to the famous Magna Carta of 1215 and partly to the Second Barons' War of the 1260s, these councils gradually evolved and gained a more formal constitutional role over the course of the 13th century. Steps were gradually taken to include representatives of the towns and counties as well as the barons, and in 1341 the House of Commons began to meet separately from the House of Lords. Since the whole purpose of Parliament was to liaise with the king, early parliaments would meet wherever the king happened to be. It's known, for example, that several parliaments met in the great northern city of York during the reigns of Edward II and Edward III. However, as Westminster became firmly established as the principal royal residence, it naturally became the place where Parliament met most frequently. By the end of the 14th century, the Queen's Chamber had become the usual meeting place of the House of Lords, whilst the Commons met in the refectory of Westminster Abbey. By the turn of the 16th century, the Palace of Westminster was falling out of favour with the royal family. More modern and comfortable palaces had been built in other locations, such as Richmond and Greenwich, and the king was spending less time at Westminster. The final blow for Westminster as a royal residence came in 1512, during the early years of Henry VIII's reign. A serious fire broke out, which destroyed much of the old Privy Palace, although the Painted Chamber and the Queen's Chamber survived. Henry chose not to rebuild the Palace of Westminster, although it was not until the 1530s that he began to develop the nearby Palace of Whitehall, which took over its role as the principal royal residence. Nevertheless, Parliament continued to meet in the surviving buildings of the Old Palace, which also continued to house the law courts and the Exchequer. From the late 1520s, the English Reformation prompted a significant increase in legislative business. Both Houses of Parliament now needed more space. For example, they needed more committee rooms and more space to store their records. Thus, they gradually took over more and more of the old palace buildings. Like the monasteries, St Stephen's College was closed down in 1548. Westminster Abbey was also dissolved, and its refectory was demolished, meaning that the House of Commons needed a new meeting place. They were therefore granted the use of the redundant college chapel, and this remained the home of the House of Commons right up until 1834. Here's another render from the Virtual St Stephen's project, which shows how the chapel was adapted to create a debating chamber for the Commons. So, that's how the English Parliament became established within the Palace of Westminster. But why did this old medieval palace eventually disappear? How did the buildings we know today come to be built? And how did the peoples of Wales, Scotland, and, for a time, Ireland come to be represented at Westminster? I hope to answer these questions in future videos. So, if you found this interesting, please remember to subscribe, and I hope to see you for future episodes of the Architecture of Politics. Thank you for watching.